So in the criminal justice section here, we're made up of mostly defense attorneys, prosecutors. What's the makeup of folks here? What do we? All of them.
Prosecutors, academics, judges, defense lawyers.
Great. Well, hopefully I'll have a little bit for all of you today. So just a quick word about the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence. I've been working on this issue for almost 30 years. I've done a lot of different things. I lobby, I do a lot of media stuff, but really one of my passions is translating evidence-based research into policy. In other words, people do a lot of great papers, they do public health journals, and they come up with research. I want to take that research and make policy. And why is policy important? Because as Dr. Hayes said, policy changes the environment. So I'm looking at how do we change the environment around around guns and death. A lot of that has to do with urban centers. So I think what we're trying to do is think, how do you take the evidence and how do you change conditions on the ground? Especially since I teach public health, if you can change the environment, you can change so much. So let me talk a little bit about the problem and the epidemiology of this issue. So we mentioned about violence. I'm talking about gun violence in particular here. But we had almost every single year, we have about 33,000 deaths each year and about 81,000 non-fatal injuries. But they're not distributed evenly, and that's going to be a theme I'm going to keep going back to. So we think about gun violence as specifically in interpersonal violence, but if you see the blue there, the blue is suicide. Fully 2/3 of American gun deaths are by suicide every year. And we don't think a lot about that, but actually it turns out there's a lot you can do about that and a lot you can impact. And when you talk about the burden of gun violence, you have to think about suicide and homicide. So what does that look like in terms of rate? It's a pretty high rate for disease. It's a rate of 10 per 100,000 will be killed by guns. 6.3 or so will be suicide, and about 3.5 per 100,000 will be homicide. So it's a pretty big burden. I mean, 33,000 deaths, and that rate, for those who do epidemiology, that's a high burden. If we were talking about disease, obviously heart disease and things like that are higher, but this is a major killer, especially for injury, when you think about injury in the United States. Now, it's always really important to understand that behind all the data and all the data points and the rates and all that kind of stuff, there are individuals who are dead, communities and families left behind, devastated, who will never be the same again. Gun violence rips at the fabric of our communities and the fabric of our families, and it's a major public health issue. And I just grabbed a cross-section of gun violence here at the top. You probably can't see it. Is Allison Parker, who was shot on air in Roanoke while she was reporting. To your left are the victims of the Charleston shooting. Top right would be the kids at Sandy Hook, and then a smattering of other people. Just everyday gun violence, which takes its toll every single day, to the tune of about 80 deaths every single day. So that's a big disease burden. We want to change the environment. I think everybody we all agree that we want to do something about that. And one of the things that's actually important to understand is that we are in some regards limited to what we can do about gun violence. And there's a reason for that. And that's because we have a Supreme Court decision that says the Second Amendment applies as an individual right to have a firearm. You have a right to have a firearm in your hearth and home. I can tell you that there's a lot of data out there that shows the risks of a firearm in the home, especially for suicide. But that's really an educational matter, right? What we can do with the legal realm is we have to balance, which is now, talk about civil rights issues. There's a right to have a firearm, but the court has said that right is not unlimited. That right has to be balanced by who can have a firearm safely. And the court specifically in Heller carved out some examples. They're not only examples, but people, for instance, who are felons are presumptively thought to be dangerous, and people, for instance, who have been committed to a mental institution, although I'm going to challenge that a little bit. in my talk. So if we want to change the environment, we are limited in what we can do. We actually have to apply what I call a risk-based approach. Who is capable and able to carry a firearm safely? And so evidence of risk and creating an environment where people who are at extreme risk for violence don't have a firearm is very important. So what are risks for dangerousness? I didn't put that up there, but I want to remind people that exposure to violence is one of the most important risks of violence. But age, gender, sorry guys, but men are much more violent than women, especially young men. Low socioeconomic status. Alcohol turns out to be an outsized role in violence. A history of violence is predictive of future violence. And serious mental illness, although as I'm going to show, not as much as people think or give sort of, we want to solve everything by solving mental illness, solving the mental health issues. That's really not the way this is going to work. And when we think about prohibitions, look, we cannot prohibit people because of low socioeconomic status. Can't do it. It's not constitutional. So in other words, you're limited there as well. And so when you think about solutions, you need to think about different types of solutions, not just gun prohibitions, although that's what I work on a lot. What's important to understand about these risk factors, though, is that and this is where the environment comes in, they do not stand alone. So if you're a woman who is older, you are upper socioeconomic status, you have no substance abuse, the chances of being violent are less than 1%, okay? But violence and risks are cumulative. So things like when you talk about young male, maybe history of arrest, history of alcohol abuse, then you are talking about a risk profile that is very high. Now, if you live in a community where these things are, where poverty is prevalent, where alcohol abuse is prevalent, then your risk factors are going to go up. And that is something that's really important to understand, that these risk factors there's comorbidity. They multiply each other. Now, I want to talk about two specific areas. And I can talk about these risk factors a lot, but there's two specific areas I think that we tend not to understand well or gloss over. And when the reason I talk about these risk factors is because ultimately, for some of them, we want to think about firearm prohibitions. Firearm, in the public health parlance, is a very dangerous vector, okay? If you have violence and you add firearms, you have lethality, you have death. So where should you prohibit firearms? Understanding that's important. At the same time, we don't want to stigmatize people who are in fact not dangerous. So, I mentioned mental illness. It turns out that mental illness by itself, without the other risk factors, is actually a very low indicator and low proportion of violence. We could get rid of, if we got rid of mental illness today, we put all the money into healthcare, we understood the genetic components, we would still have 96% of the violence we have in society. So it's important not to overemphasize the idea of mental illness or say we can solve gun violence by just curing mental illness. Now, that does not mean that mental illness at certain times, under certain circumstances, does not lead to violence. So the data shows that if you go to the sort of left of this chart, people who are involuntarily committed because they're a danger to themselves or others, they're in a first episode psychosis, or they end up in the emergency room, are in fact dangerous for a certain amount of time. But people who are in treatment and medicated if necessary are a much lower risk. So understanding where the risk is very important, because mental illness by itself, most people with mental illness are much more likely to be a victim of crime or abused than to commit violence. So that's something that I think is very important. The population attributable risk for suicide relating to mental illness is much higher. So suicide and mental illness are much more correlated, which I think is very important. So when you think about firearms prohibitions, we have to understand that. Now, let me talk about another sort of, I don't know if it's a misconception, but a disparity that's worth talking about. If on the left side of the slide you see suicide, and the right side is homicide, you will see that for whatever reason, suicide is predominantly, I mean by huge margins, something, if you break it out by race, something that is predominantly affected in the white community. Homicide is is disproportionately the victims are African American, as are the shooters, and it's of course more than half when African Americans make up less than half of the population. So there's a real disproportion there. So I want to show you what that looks like graphically. And so the blue line is white men, and you can see that in suicides they're disproportionately the victims of suicide. And so when we think, and by large numbers, so when we think about gun violence, oftentimes we think of that as an urban problem and only a problem that over-affects African Americans. That's just not true. It's something that goes across society but affects us differently. So, and then just to look at graphically again, the red line is firearm homicides, and that is disproportionately affected in the African American community. Now, when we think about policy, I think it's important to think about why may that be? Why this disproportion? And I wanted to put the slide back here because to the extent that structural racism has affected poverty and other issues like access to health care, that may give us a clue about what's going on here. So remember these risk factors: poverty, right? Serious mental illness, history of arrest. Those things can contribute in a way, and I want to make it important. These risk factors, skin color is not a risk factor, okay? It's environment that is important. I think it's really to understand that we need to think about poverty across the board as a risk factor, and it affects white and black communities in the same. But if the effect of structural racism is to make certain communities less wealthy, then those communities may be, in fact, be more violent. So thinking about poverty, we see that in the African American community is subject to poverty at 3 times the rate of their white counterparts. And the unemployment for African Americans is double that of whites. Now, that's not to say that's the only reason. This is a complicated reason. But when you think about solving violence, it's a access to firearms issue, but it's also an environmental issue. And Dr. Hayes, I was so glad you mentioned the idea that we need to work in the idea and investing in communities, because those things, access to firearms and investing in communities, go together to stop violence. That's something that's very important. So let me give you, I'm going to wind down in just a few minutes, but let me just give you a couple of thoughts and a couple of closing, a couple more slides that I think explain where I want to go with this. So whatever the risk factors, easy access to guns increases lethality both in interpersonal violence and suicide. People who use guns, for instance, in suicide, 5% of the attempts, 50% of the completions, lethality rate of 85%. If you try to poison yourself, about 5% chance you'll actually die. Same thing with interpersonal violence. You get hit by a fist, much more likely to survive than if you get hit by a bullet. But the other thing is, and I don't know that I would have said this a number of years ago, because I've worked my whole life on the gun policy side, but I really believe this now. You need to work on the gun policy side, but you also need to look at other more holistic approach and looking at issues like poverty at the same time. We don't need to pick one or the other. We should work on all of it. And that turns out to be very important. So you think about the firearm prohibitions first. So what are the lethality stuff? We all know about felonies that are being, being prohibitory, involuntarily committed to a mental institution, misdemeanor crime of domestic violence. These are all federal prohibitions. But if you look at the data that I showed you about risk factors, they don't really capture them, the risk factors that we're most concerned about, very well. In fact, these risk factors are both over and under inclusive, and my work is to make it really much more targeted to where the risk actually is. So if I were the king of the world, and what I do most days is try to convince policymakers to think about adding some of these other prohibitions. One is, we talked about commitment as a mental health risk factor, but you know what? Most people don't get committed these days because there's not enough beds and it takes a lot of process. A lot of people end up being involuntarily hospitalized against their will, but they're out 72 hours. Some states make that a prohibition for a shorter time, not a lifetime prohibition, but a prohibition of 5 years. I think that's very good policy. If you look at the chart where I put where the risk factors are, those who have been involuntarily hospitalized have a much higher risk factor. But I thought mental illness risk factors, as I mentioned, are a small proportion of this. Where's the other risk? Well, if prior acts of violence are a good indicator of risk, why are we making it why are felonies the only indicator? Why not make it more on violence? So I think violent misdemeanors should be prohibited for a set of period. And maybe even I think it's actually important to be able to look at nonviolent offenders, think about how we develop important restoration programs, which we haven't done, but I think that's important. Other issue that I'm going to talk about, I want to mention, history of, alcohol abuse is a huge factor. You can't prohibit somebody because they drink too much, but what about where there's due process, where people have convicted of multiple DUIs? A number of states have that, and it turns out it's looking more and more effective. The last intervention I want to talk about is something called a gun violence restraining order. We've all heard about domestic violence restraining orders. The beauty of domestic violence restraining orders, they're civil in process, they don't leave a criminal record, and they are responsive to emerging threats of violence. Your spouse is acting violence, you can go get a restraining order before maybe a felony gets convicted. This group I work with, called the Consortium for Risk-Based Firearm Policy, which is a group of academics that I work with, we looked at the idea of these contemporaneous risk factors, threats of violence, low level of acts of violence that maybe you don't have a conviction for, and developed the idea of a gun violence restraining order, just like a domestic violence restraining order, but just targeted for law enforcement and family members to say, my loved one, someone's in crisis, if I can go to a judge and show that they're dangerous, can I remove the firearm temporarily so someone can get some help? That turns out to be really important. I heard this from psychiatrists and other mental health professionals all the time. People come to me, they're dangerous, they're acting dangerous, they don't have a mental health condition. I can't commit them because maybe they're an alcoholic. Maybe they have maybe they have a concussion. How do I get the firearm out of their hands while they get treatment? Gun violence restraining order is a great idea. Part of it's been active in Connecticut. We just got some new data, which is very encouraging. And then California just passed the nation's first gun violence restraining order that includes family members. And that's been in effect now since the beginning of the year. And I can tell you that I had a sheriff in Santa Barbara County where, remember, we had a terrible school shooting in Santa Barbara a couple years ago, thanked me just last week for helping develop this type of restraining order because it really helps law enforcement, gives them clear legal authority to remove a firearm in times of danger. Last thought. It's not just developing prohibitions, it's working on the root causes. And so I've been very pleased with the Urban Institute and with the Joint Center on Policy and Economic Studies, Spencer Overton and the Joyce Foundation, to work on a new report called Engaging Communities and Reducing Gun Violence, which not only talks about gun policies, but also mentions other things that are very important in reducing violence. And I'm just going to briefly mention those. It turns out in urban violence, there's a small number of people who drive a lot of the risk, and that's sort of the contagion model, the public health. We want to stop that contagion model. Law enforcement has an important role to play here, but when you have an adverse relationship with the community, that actually makes the community more violent. Social services are woefully underfunded, and evidence-based social services are important, as is policy. And finally, we need to have communities engaged in developing that policy. They can't be, hey, this is a policy developed from above. We must put the resources in the hands of the community and help them develop evidence-based proposals to move forward. So the final thing I'll just leave you with is if we want to stop violence at an environmental level, we need to look at the evidence-based risk factors, develop reasonable firearm prohibitions based on those risk factors, but also address the root causes of violence. And I think if we do that, we can really reduce this terrible public health problem.
Thank you, Josh. We will now